Rude tenant sues landlord, then learns he's her long-lost father. The rain poured relentlessly against the dimly lit city streets as Olivia Carter clutched a wrinkled legal notice in her trembling hands. Her breath came in sharp, angry bursts as she climbed the stairs of her apartment complex, her frustration mounting with every step. The fluorescent hallway lights flickered above her, casting eerie shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Room 4B was her sanctuary, her battle zone, and now, the site of an impending legal war. With a firm grip, she unlocked her door, pushing it open with enough force to rattle the cheap furniture inside. The apartment was small but well-kept, the shelves lined with law books, a testament to her pursuit of justice. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on her kitchen counter, a relic of her sleepless nights studying tenant rights and landlord laws. She had always been the type to stand her ground, never one to back down from a fight, especially one she believed she was right about. And this time, she knew she was. The new landlord, some faceless corporate figure, had raised the rent beyond reason, enforcing fines and penalties that seemed almost punitive. Olivia had tried reasoning with the property manager, but her complaints had fallen on deaf ears. Her fingers tightened around the letter. They were sorely mistaken if they thought she was just another tenant who would roll over and accept their unjust demands. Tomorrow morning, she would file a lawsuit. A clap of thunder shook the building as she threw herself onto her couch, exhaling sharply. The fight was only just beginning, and Olivia Carter was ready to take them on. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that the man she was about to sue, the so-called ruthless landlord, was the father she had never met. The man who had unknowingly shaped her very existence. And tomorrow, when she walked into that courtroom, her world would change forever. Conflict Introduction, The Catalyst. The morning sun barely peeked through Olivia's curtains as she sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open and her legal notes scattered across the surface. She had spent the entire night researching tenant laws, cross-referencing cases, and outlining her argument. A strong cup of coffee sat untouched beside her, the rising steam the only sign of life in the still apartment. Her phone vibrated against the wooden table. A message from her best friend, Mia, lit up the screen. "Are you sure about this? Taking on the landlord in court is huge." Olivia's fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed back. "I have no choice. If I don't fight, who will?" She pressed send and exhaled sharply, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every tenant who had been unfairly evicted, who had been pressured into paying unlawful fees, who had been treated as nothing more than an expendable source of income. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She frowned, pushing away from the table. When she opened the door, she was met with the sharp gaze of the building's property manager, Greg Lawson. A smug smirk stretched across his lips as he held out an official-looking envelope. "Miss Carter," he drawled. "I assume you're already aware of this." Olivia snatched the envelope, ripping it open. The letter confirmed what she had feared, the eviction notice was final. She had less than 30 days to vacate the premises. "You can't do this," she snapped. "I have proof that these charges are illegal." Greg chuckled, adjusting his tie. "Take it up with the landlord." Her jaw clenched as she watched him saunter down the hallway, whistling as if he hadn't just shattered her world. She slammed the door, breathing hard. Anger bubbled beneath her skin, but she forced herself to focus. This was exactly why she needed to go through with the lawsuit. She wouldn't be intimidated. Turning back to her laptop, she opened a new document and began typing her case file. She would see this through, no matter what it took. What Olivia didn't know was that the landlord she was preparing to take down in court was none other than the father she never met, the man whose name she had never spoken, who had vanished before she was born. And soon, both their lives would be changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. Olivia arrived at the courthouse early, her heart pounding in anticipation. Clutching her legal brief, she walked through the large glass doors, the sound of her heels echoing against the polished floors. The weight of what she was about to do settled in her chest, but she steadied herself. This was her fight, and she had no intention of backing down. As she approached the courtroom, she caught sight of Greg Lawson standing near the entrance, engaged in an animated conversation with a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. The man turned slightly, and Olivia froze. His salt and pepper hair, the sharp jawline, it was a face she had only seen in an old, faded photograph tucked away in her mother's belongings. Her breath hitched as realization dawned. This was him. David Calloway. Her landlord. Her father. The air around her seemed to be still, the sounds of the busy courthouse fading into a dull hum. She forced herself to take a step forward, her grip tightening on her files. This wasn't the time for emotions. She had a case to fight. Inside the courtroom, Olivia's lawyer, James DeWitt, was already setting up at their designated table. He gave her a reassuring nod as she slid into the chair beside him. Opposite them, David Calloway took his place with his high-powered legal team. He hadn't acknowledged her, not yet. All rise, the bailiff announced as the judge entered, bringing the courtroom to order. Olivia squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. This was bigger than her personal feelings. This was about justice. The initial proceedings were formal and procedural. Olivia remained calm as James presented their argument, citing unlawful rent hikes, intimidation tactics, and clear violations of tenant rights. She stole a glance at Calloway. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. The judge called upon her to testify. Olivia took a deep breath and walked to the stand. She spoke with conviction, detailing the struggles tenants faced under Calloway's management, the unreasonable fines, the forced evictions. Every word was a blow against the empire he had built, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was also tearing down something much more personal. When the opposing counsel began their cross-examination, they wasted no time. Miss Carter, would you say your passion for this case is fueled by personal vendetta rather than legal standing? Olivia's spine stiffened. I would say my passion is fueled by the injustice I and so many others have suffered under this landlord's policies. Calloway's lawyer pressed on. And yet, despite claiming hardship, you continue to reside in the same unit? I have no choice, Olivia retorted. Affordable housing is a right, not a privilege. A small murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge called for order, and Olivia held her breath as she caught sight of Calloway's expression. For the first time, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. The questioning continued, but Olivia stood firm. She was here for a fight, and she would see it through. As court adjourned for the day, she gathered her things, preparing to leave. That's when she heard his voice. Olivia. She turned slowly. David Calloway stood a few feet away, his posture stiff, his gaze locked on hers. I didn't know, he said, his voice quieter than she expected. Not until today. Her stomach twisted. Would it have changed anything? He hesitated, then shook his head. No. Business is business. Olivia's chest ached, but she forced herself to nod. Then I guess I'll see you in court. She turned on her heel and walked away, her resolve stronger than ever. The battle was far from over, and she would fight until the very end. The courtroom was tense, a charged atmosphere settling over the gathered spectators as Olivia Carter took her place at the plaintiff's table. The weeks of preparation, the endless research, and the weight of her emotions had all led to this very moment. Across from her, David Calloway sat with his high-powered attorneys, his face unreadable. He had barely acknowledged her existence beyond legal proceedings, and that cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Judge Martinez glanced over the case notes before addressing the room. We'll now hear final arguments before reaching a ruling. Mr. DeWitt, you may proceed. Olivia's lawyer, James DeWitt, stood confidently. Your Honor, my client has presented undeniable proof of the defendant's exploitative practices. Excessive fines, unlawful evictions, and intimidation tactics have run rampant under Mr. Calloway's ownership. Tenants have suffered financial hardship and emotional distress. We ask this court to hold him accountable. As DeWitt spoke, Olivia's eyes flickered toward Calloway, searching for any sign of remorse. But he remained stone-faced, his hands folded in front of him. Calloway's lead attorney, Margaret Ellis, rose to deliver her defense. Your Honor, the defense maintains that these claims are exaggerated. My client operates within the law. The plaintiff's case is built on sentiment rather than legal merit. Olivia clenched her fists beneath the table. She could feel the fire rising within her. This wasn't just a case. This was her life. Judge Martinez turned to Olivia. Miss Carter, you've been an advocate for yourself and your fellow tenants throughout this case. If you have any final statement, now is the time. The room fell silent as Olivia stood. She had prepared for this, yet now, standing before the judge, her father mere feet away, words felt heavier than ever. I'm here today because my home, and the homes of so many others, are at risk. Mr. Calloway may operate within the letter of the law, but the law doesn't always protect the vulnerable. What's legal isn't always what's right, she said, her voice steady but firm. She turned to face Calloway directly. And that's what you don't understand. You think this is just business. But to us, it's survival. For the first time, she saw it, a flicker of something in Calloway's expression. Uncertainty? Guilt? She couldn't tell. But she pressed on. I didn't know who you were when I filed this lawsuit. I only knew I was fighting for what was fair. Now, I know you're my father. And you still won't look me in the eye. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Martinez seemed momentarily taken aback. Calloway's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Olivia thought he would remain silent. But then, to everyone's surprise, he stood. I was unaware of Miss Carter's identity when these proceedings began, Calloway said, his voice even but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. That doesn't change the facts of this case. No, it doesn't, Olivia shot back. But it does change one thing, you have the chance to make this right. Not as a businessman, but as a person. A heavy silence stretched between them. The judge cleared her throat. Mr. Calloway, do you wish to offer any settlement or resolution before I proceed with my ruling? Calloway hesitated, then turned to his attorneys, who whispered frantically among themselves. Margaret Ellis looked displeased, but eventually, Calloway lifted a hand to silence her. He exhaled sharply and looked at Olivia for the first time, truly looking at her. I propose a settlement, he said finally. We will implement a rent freeze for the next 5 years and establish an independent review board for tenant complaints. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Olivia's heart pounded. This was more than she had hoped for. But it wasn't just about winning the case, it was about what came next. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. Miss Carter, do you accept the defendant's proposal? Olivia's voice was steady. On one condition. He meets the tenants himself. He sees the impact his policies have had, firsthand. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. Agreed. A gavel struck, signaling the end of the case. Olivia let out a slow breath as a mixture of victory and exhaustion washed over her. As she gathered her papers, she felt a presence beside her. Calloway stood there, his expression unreadable. You remind me of your mother, he said quietly. Olivia swallowed hard. You never knew me. But maybe now, you will. Without another word, she turned and walked away. The battle had been fought, but her story with David Calloway was only just beginning. The weight of the trial lifted slowly as Olivia Carter stepped out of the courthouse. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, grounding her in reality. She had fought for justice, and she had won, not just for herself, but for every tenant who had suffered under Calloway's policies. The rent freeze, the independent review board, these weren't just legal victories. They were lifelines for the people who had struggled for too long. James DeWitt walked beside her, his usual confident smirk softened into something almost proud. You did good, Olivia, he said. Not just in court. You forced him to see the human cost of his actions. That's more than most ever achieve. She nodded, her mind still processing everything. The courtroom battle was over, but there was one more confrontation she needed to face. Later that afternoon, Olivia arrived at a modest brownstone in the heart of the city. The address had been given to her in a hastily scribbled note from Calloway before he left the courthouse. She hesitated at the door before knocking. It opened within moments. David Calloway stood there, looking older, more tired than she remembered from court. For the first time, he wasn't wearing the armor of a ruthless businessman. He was just a man, one who had made mistakes, one who was perhaps trying to correct them. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside. She entered, noting the lack of grandeur she had expected. The space was warm, filled with old books and framed photographs. A glimpse into a life she had never been a part of. Calloway cleared his throat. "I never knew about you, Olivia. Your mother never told me. If I had known, things might have been different." She studied him, searching for deception, but found none. Just regret. Just honesty. "Maybe," she said. "But we can't change the past. Only what comes next." A silence settled between them, neither uncomfortable nor forced. A beginning, not an ending. As Olivia left that evening, she felt a strange sense of closure. Calloway wasn't forgiven, not entirely, but he had taken a step forward, and so had she. That night, as she sat in her apartment, still hers, thanks to the settlement, she looked out at the city, at the lights flickering against the dark sky. This fight had started as a battle between landlord and tenant, but it had become so much more. It had become a journey of discovery, of facing the unknown, of reclaiming power. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia Carter felt truly free. Months had passed since the trial, but its ripples continued to spread. The tenants of Olivia's building no longer lived in fear of sudden evictions or unfair fines. The Independent Review Board had begun investigating past cases, overturning wrongful penalties, and holding landlords accountable. For the first time in years, the people in that building could breathe, knowing someone had stood up for them, and won. Olivia walked past the complex, nodding at familiar faces who now greeted her with smiles instead of worried glances. She had become more than just another tenant, she had become a symbol of change. The weight of the fight had been heavy, but the victory made it worthwhile. At her small but growing law practice, a framed newspaper article hung on the wall, "Tenant Advocate Wins Landmark Case Against Corporate Landlord." Underneath it was a quote she had underlined in ink: "Justice is persistence, and persistence is power." The door chimed as a new client stepped in, a young mother clutching a notice of eviction. Olivia stood, extending her hand. "Let's talk about this," she said with a determined smile. Across town, David Calloway sat in his office, staring at the list of reforms now in place because of his defeat. It had cost him money, but more than that, it had forced him to see the people behind the numbers. For the first time in his career, he questioned the legacy he was leaving behind. One evening, he sent Olivia a message: "You were right. Business shouldn't come before people. I'm still learning. Thank you." She read the text and exhaled slowly. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. As the city moved forward, so did she. This battle had been won, but there were many more to fight. And Olivia Carter was ready. Because justice, once ignited, never truly fades.